Hi, so I'm Henrique. I'm going to talk here about my experience basically forking a Go project. Um, so the idea was basically I was working with Postgres and I wanted to build a SQL query builder that was tailored for Postgres with its um, native binary protocol rather than the textual protocol we often use. Ooh.
It's okay, it's coming back a bit behind you. There's a little box. Don't step on it, and then it's going to the next one. It's okay for now.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Good. So, where's my cursor? Yeah. So, why a query builder in the first place? So, I favor writing regular SQL queries instead. But in some cases, for example, whenever you need to apply multiple filters, sometimes a query builder can be interesting and it becomes less repetitive and less error prone. One alternative that I see a lot of people using is to use the objective relational mapping, for example. But I prefer not to go to this route as I like to keep my code free from magic and surprises. The way this happened, the way I decided to create this was after some discussions with a former co-worker of mine about this topic because we had just worked on database migrations. So yeah, basically I decided to create it in the let's say that the most yes. Ooh, it's not here. What? Okay. Let me. Yeah. Let me change the cursor. Oh, okay, good. All right.
Yeah, welcome.
Okay, so the idea was basically this. I wanted to have a query builder that I could trust and that I could have the best performance possible in terms not of creating the queries, because that's not really what matters, but in terms of writing good SQL queries for it take advantage of the Postgres binary protocol. So what were my options? I would say that in Go, basically, my only good option for a query builder was Squirrel. It works quite good, but it didn't attend everything that I wanted it to. Because it was designed to be, let's say, a generic query builder. And also its source code was much more complex than it needs to be, in my opinion. So I decided to play a little bit with it and see if I was able to design something that was more interesting. Yeah, the first challenge was I needed to choose a name. This is one of the hardest things in computer science. After I forked it on my machine, and started playing with it to see what it used as in terms of dependencies and so on and so on. So I decided that I wouldn't necessarily follow the Squirrel API, but if possible, I would do so. So I changed a few things here and there, like I introduced a few methods, removed some others that doesn't make much sense, and so on. And in terms of API differences, it's not much. I would say if you have a project that uses PGX with the binary protocol, you can probably just try PGQ in an hour. Let's say if you have not that big of a project, maybe even less time, and it should work fine. One of the things is even some decisions that I initially imagined that, okay, I don't like this, for example, fluent interfaces. I'm not a big fan of fluent interfaces. But then I tried to do something else. In the end, I was convinced that, okay, they actually have something interesting here, and I decided to use that. So it was mostly a discovery process. It wasn't really just changing the code to remove everything that wasn't related to Postgres. So some changes were basically removing codes, but after that I started seeing how I could improve the API, for example, to introduce support to some stuff like in Postgres you have these insert options, but then you don't have limiting the offset for deleting, updating, and so on. And I wanted to make sure that the SQL builder would be able to help the developer, because if it's not really helping, if it's just like another way to write SQL code, I would rather just write SQL code, because I don't see a benefit in using something just to mask what is really happening. And they also, something important here is that I broke compatibility with the database SQL package. And that is because it didn't make much sense to allow this compatibility, because the queries that PGQ generates isn't really compatible when you are using this any longer. Because there are a few things like, we are going to see in a bit, when you generate a query, it's too small, right? So let me try to, when you, not good, but still, when you generate, for example, online, you see, for example, that variable there, exclude the contracts, and then you have another one, where is it? Sorry, it's too small. The exclude the contracts, for example. Oh no. It's a slice, and then if you are using Squirrel, it's basically going to create a placeholder for each value you have in the slice, and that is awful. It's especially awful because it means that any prepared statements that you generate will only serve for that amount of values in that slice and so on. So you can end up having lots of prepared statements on your server for no good reason, and so on and so on. So I didn't want that. I wanted to try to make the API as concise as possible, and also I wanted to provide a good experience. So there was a surprise that I didn't expect it, or at least didn't expect it much. It was regarding performance. So first thing is, does this even matter? Because we are not talking about the performance of the database calls, let's say, I'm talking about the performance in generating strings. That seems to be like a much smaller problem. But Squirrel tries to do some caching. They try to be wise about it in a way that I feel that isn't helpful for two reasons. First, because as we are going to see, maybe it's not really helping it. And the second, it's even if it's helping, let's suppose this, it's not really where the bottleneck is if you are communicating with the database. If you are communicating with the database, there will be things like latency, a TCP connection, for example, in the so on. So it basically has a lot of code that introduces complexity for developers that are trying to understand what the query builder is doing. So that is something that it was the first thing that I decided, if I'm gonna do this side project just for fun, I'm gonna get rid of most everything that doesn't seem to be really helping. Okay. Yeah. So first, wait, that's the correct one? No. Sorry. Oh yeah. How do we write benchmarks? How many of you have written benchmarks in Go? And how many of you have written unity tests? Okay, so here's the thing. If you know how to write unity tests, you know how to write the benchmarks, basically. Because the API is not that different, I mean, the API is really simple. You can learn it with 15 minutes, being pessimistic. So that's what I'm gonna show you in the next slide. Yeah, I guess you can read this. Basically, instead of using a testing.t, you use a testing.b. And if you take the time to read the documentation of testing.b once, you know what to do. You can see, for example, here, what this code is doing is, it has a loop that is gonna call whatever you want to test n times. And that n is dynamic, it's a high number, as we are going to see here, for example. And whenever you basically write a code like this, and you call go test, passing the bench flag, it's gonna run all your benchmarks, for example, if you pass, just to clarify, the bench flag is just like the run flag where you pass a regex, and then it filters the tests that, or in this case, the benchmark tests that you want to run. So in this case, for example, we are basically running that randy.int, this 600 million, I guess, times, and each operation is taking about 18 nanoseconds. This is another example that is more close to the benchmark I did with Squirrel and with another fork that I found out. As you see, I don't do anything special besides just iterating any times and running my own code. And if you have something more complex, there are other functions in the B type, like the start timer, the stop timer, and a few other functions that might help you in situations, for example, if you have so many expensive operations that you need to run during your benchmark. Ideally, you should actually prepare everything ahead, and just then you start your benchmark. But let's say that for some reason you can't do that, then you can always pause the benchmark for a bit, do whatever you needed to do that takes time, and then continue. What else? There are ways for you to run benchmarking in parallel as well. Sometimes you might need that, usually not, but yeah. And here is how, those are just references. This is how it looks when you run Go test and you pass the bench flag. Let me see if I can zoom in. Yeah, here in passing a dot, it could be like the beginning of this, for example, to filter everything that matches this. I'm also using the bench main. That is basically what this bench main flag does is now you also have the numbers of allocation statistics here. So each operation took 29 allocations, for example, and the amount that was allocated. This is why I think that Squirrel is probably doing, let's say, much more than it should be doing in terms of using a caching layer and so on. Because you see that the execution time for my fork and also for SQRT, that's the other fork that I found out, it's quite small. The difference here is that SQRT, it appears that they decided that, how can I say this? They decided that you don't need to run, let's say, queries in multiple Go routines. That I agree with, but I don't have this problem in PGQ. So basically, this is not thread safe. The SQRT, I haven't really investigated their code a lot, so I don't understand the reason why. But you see that the numbers of allocations and the time of execution and also the memory that it's using in both are much smaller in Squirrel. So, of course, I'm not an expert in benchmarks. I might be doing a lot wrong there, but at least this gives me confidence that my code should be, equally as fast as Squirrel, even if I have some problems in my benchmarking. And why I find that this is something important, because sometimes we try to premature optimize something much sooner, of course, because it's premature, but anyways, we try to optimize something much sooner than when it's time. And that means that we might invest a lot of effort into doing so that is not really needed. And I feel this serves as I'm not saying necessarily that Squirrel is prematurely optimized, but definitely, even if it is not, it looks like it, doesn't make a lot of difference for what it is. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Have any questions? Yes. Okay, so let's say that by the time I did, it was just a hobby. Basically, I was working at a company, let's say maybe 6 months before, and I helped them create an infrastructure for migrating from a NoSQL database to Postgres. And one of the things that I noticed was that some developers wanted to use query builders or objective relational mapping. And not only that, but in my professional career, And then I never liked the idea of complicating too much. I prefer the simplicity that we find in the Go ecosystem. That is basically, you can write the SQL queries, just do it, that's fine. But they, just, discussion with people, one colleague of mine basically sold me the idea that query builders are really useful. And then he gave me some convincing arguments, like if you needed to do many filters, it can be a little bit easier on the developers. So we were using Squirrel at that company. And then I decided, okay, I already left the company, but I'm just curious. I can do this in a week or two. I have no idea how long it took, to be honest. Okay, let me try. Yeah. Yes?
How do you deal with joins?
Okay, joins. All right, let me say this. I'm not a SQL expert either, but the API that I'm using is basically Squirrels with my modifications. And if you see the Git repository, you're going to see that it's not a lot of modifications, So basically, everything that you can do in Squirrel, you can do with mine. The thing is, if you use mine, you also have to use the PGX, because it's the only driver that currently supports. And I imagine that another driver won't appear the binary protocol of Postgres. And it just works with the very same API. Yeah. So basically, you can imagine that internally it maintains some state, like it maintains partial subqueries, and as you go writing queries, you can basically connect the pieces using the functions it provides. Yeah, as I said, I'm not a huge fan of this idea. If possible, I write these vanilla pure SQL queries, but then in some cases this is helpful. Yeah, or at least for some people. Yeah, of course.
My personal experience with mappers is, kind of mixed one.
Mm-hmm.
They work great for very simple, let's say, selects.
Yeah.
They're amazing. The moment your database schema gets a little bit more complicated, like you need to query or table join, it gets complicated.
Just write SQL.
Yes, exactly. So
it makes things that are easier, and the harder thing is harder, right?
Yeah. So kind of let me say one thing before ask the question. So what my experience is that whenever we try to use object relationship mappers to implement complex queries, in the end, they were all thrown out and replaced with handwritten SQL queries because they proved to be more efficient.
I agree.
Now, the question is, do you have your kind of hands-on experience trying to use this tool of yours in real projects that do have these, multiple joins that they need to query, and how did it go?
No, I don't, because this was like after I left the company. In the day they used something else there, but I would be confident to do it. I mean, I have some integration tests that validates that the queries are generated as intended for a few cases, not too complex cases, to be honest, because this was a hobby project. But I would say it's probably safe to use, especially if you write a decent integration tests. That's something that I always prefer rather than unit tests. Yes?
Do you have a temptation to upstream some of your fixes to original project?
Well, no, for two reasons. First, if you go to the Squirrel repository, you see that they are in a feature complete phase. And I would say that might be a little bit risky to just send the upstream. for example, because the performance idea, I mean, I don't think it's worth the risk to send it upstream. However, if you have a project that is well tested, you already use the SQL, you already use integration tests you already use PGX, and you don't use at all the textual protocol, I would say just give it a go because it's probably gonna work fine. Of course, there is a buzz factor of 1. I must say that. Anything else? Thank you.